Brazilian Shirt Name Podcast with Dotun and Tim Vickery.
Yeah, it's part two of the Brazilian Shirt Name podcast, the Global Soccer Interactive, where you can join in the conversation. Now, we're talking football from all around the world as we do. Feel free in that little chat box to the bottom right-hand corner to join us as you choose. And do remember to subscribe to the pod and also join us on our WhatsApp group. Pleased to say, Tim, that we've got our good friend Amos Murphy from The Express and also from the City Ramble podcast with us as well. Great to have you back, Amos.
Absolute pleasure, guys. How are we?
Yeah, you and I probably do much better than Tim because I'll tell you why. Do you know why? When he can't understand why we over here in Europe aren't bothered about the Copa Libertadores and the Club World Cup and all those competitions they're bothered in, it's because we have got a cracking Champions League to concentrate on. We ain't got the time, Tim. It's too much good football, not least this week.
Yeah, and we didn't have the time to do a part one this week. So you announced this as part two of the Brazilian Shirt Name podcast. This is a part two without part one, which reminds me a little bit. Do you remember? And do they still do this? Do like magazines and that still do this? Issue 2 given away free with issue 1. Yes. So this is part 2 being given away free without part 1.
Magazines don't exist anymore is the answer to your first question. But grammatically speaking, I was correct though, because this is part 2. Doesn't mean that you have to have a part 1. It's just like this is part 2. Like if you watch a TV series, this is part 2. Doesn't matter if you've watched part 1 or even if part 1 exists or not. This is actually just part 2. So
reasons to be cheerful. 1, 2, 3.
Now we've got around that. Amos, I mean, I kid you not when I say that this has been a cracking week in the Champions League. On Tuesday night and Wednesday night, we're treated to a feast of matches. But perhaps even more importantly, one of the most dramatic upsets in Champions League history. The tiny town of Bodo Glimt have got this football club now that have beaten Inter Milan not once above the Arctic Circle, but twice in their own backyard. And Inter Milan, let's not forget, were last year's finalists.
Yeah, it's remarkable, isn't it? And I think it's even more remarkable when you look at the fact that Bodo Glimt aren't playing league football because of obviously the conditions in Norway. And their last 4 competitive matches, beating Manchester City, beating Atletico Madrid away, and then doing the double over Inter Milan, including that result at San Siro. I mean, I imagine Milan as a city is just sick of Norway at the moment because obviously Italy got turned over in the World Cup qualifying 4-1 I think it was at San Siro back in November if I remember correctly, and then obviously we've just had the Milano Cortina games where Norway have topped the medal table and Norway have been absolutely running away with it there. And what do they cap it off with? An absolutely sort of sensational, almost throwback if I would say so, in terms of the old European Cup where you have these sort of teams that you maybe aren't necessarily as accustomed to rocking up, and when it used to be, straight knockouts, obviously. Had to go through a little bit of a fluff to get there, but yeah, amazing for Birdo, an absolute fantastic story. What that means for Italian football, though, is, I think the horse has certainly bolted, and I'm sure we'll discuss it, but yeah, they're, I guess to be fair, often are, but they're in a sort of a perpetual crisis once again.
Although Atalanta saved the day for Italian football as a whole. Maybe we'll get into that as well, Tim. Bodo Glimt, and you know quite a lot about the history of this Champions League, but also the European Cup that Amos mentioned a moment or two ago. Can you think of anything that rivaled this? Given where Bodo Glimt are in the far north of Norway, in the Arctic Circle, town of 50,000 people, versus the mighty Inter Milan. It don't make sense.
No, it doesn't. And it's great, isn't it? Especially as these results are not just happening at home, on the synthetic pitch and so on. They've been doing it away from home as well. And it seems to me, and I would love your opinions on this, this is exactly what the Champions League needs. An antidote to, the concentration of wealth and so on, and a growing predictability. So I would have thought this is just an absolute godsend for the competition.
No, I
Let's
totally subscribe to that. Yeah, absolutely.
I was going to say, Amos, I suppose it's the format as well that's allowed this. The extra matches in the format allowed smaller teams to come and compete against the bigger teams. And perhaps at times when the bigger teams are competing in 2, 3 or 4 different other tournaments as well. So you're catching them when they're knackered. Certainly, if we
Yeah.
Galatasaray and Juventus, you can see how knackered they were. But Juventus,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. In terms of the fact that they've not had that competitive sort of domestic football that has drained the legs, and you might look at that and you go, excuse me, you might look at that and you go, well, they're not up to speed, they're not up to scratch, they've not got that sort of match fitness that people bang on about, also, all over. But and you've got a team that is as drilled and as efficient as Bodo Glimt, and you do get something like this where Inter Milan, obviously, in isolation, you could have conversations about, the quality of the squad, and maybe they haven't refreshed or invested as much as you would need to succeed at this level. But the 10 points clear at the top of Serie A. They are, objectively a good team. And to be fair, in the league phase, apart from the game against Arsenal, who Arsenal topped that league phase, they were really good for most of it. They lost to Liverpool at home, but it was a more than controversial penalty decision. And I think even if the Italians are saying that a player's gone down easily in the box, then you've probably sort of figured that one out for yourself. And yeah, I mean, they would have been massively disappointed to have dropped into that playoff spot, but you draw Bodo Glimt, who, obviously they beat City, they beat Atletico. You're thinking that's just a purple patch. Well, egg on their face, egg on our face, egg on everyone's face, because they really have sort of shown what great coaching, great investment, and that sort of old school team mentality can deliver.
I think Amos has hit upon something really crucial there at the end of that. Tim, when he talks about team mentality, it's almost as if, because the major leagues in Europe have focused very much, and not least the Premier League, obviously, which everybody else follows, has focused very much on individual talents, and stars coming in, and the number of stars you can bring into your team makes you a successful team. But they've forgotten the flipping basics, which is it's a team sport. And Bodo Glimt, when they were facing Inter, I'm not saying Inter were playing disjointed, but Bodo Glimt played as if, we are a family. We know what we're doing. We've got each other's backs, and we're running for each other. We are playing as a team. And it's almost like you could see the tactics working. Whereas on the other hand, you saw Inter trying to work them out, and thinking, well, it's simple. They're playing together. There's a lot to be said for team effort as opposed to, individual talents, which we think about.
Two roads diverged in the wood, and I got hopelessly lost. No, I took the one less travelled by. Is this part of their secret, that they are different in a way, maybe a little bit like Greece winning those Euros in 2004, when they brought back man-to-man marking and no one could really work out? Is this, what's the secret, do you think, Amos? How have they been able to take this road less travelled by?
Do you know what I think it is? You look at the manager, Knutsen, and he's been there yonks, he's been there years, and that is so unusual for, and we have to say now, a top European team. They're in the last 16 of the Champions League, and last season they got to the semi-finals of the Europa League. Of course, it feels like a novelty, but this has been a consistent rise, and a little bit like Atalanta, Dotun, you mentioned before. They had a similar sort of rise, but not necessarily as fairy tale as this. He's been there since 2018. He's been in the building, I think, since maybe 2016, 2017, something like that, possibly even earlier. And there are so many factors that play a part in this as well. And just being clever as a football club, which sounds like it's a given, but you look across Europe and you look across the landscape of football, and that is not necessarily happening. In top European clubs. But I think you can't underestimate the impact that just having a guy there who has been there for a while, and players will come and go, that's fine, but they know and they trust each other to sort of get themselves out of potential problems. I mean, they didn't win the league in Norway last season, and that was maybe.
That I think is the funniest thing. This isn't
crazy.
even Norway's best team. It's not,
Yeah.
you know that bloke, the famous commentator who's passed away now, who said, Margaret Thatcher, Winston Churchill, Tim Vickery, are you listening?
Lord Anthony Eden. That was always my favourite. Lord Anthony Eden.
Did he put that in as well? Sir Anthony, if you don't mind. But I don't know if anybody wants to be a lord anymore in the UK, by the way.
True.
I remember David Bowie saying, and how sort of how much foresight David Bowie had when he was offered a gong. He said, look, some of the people have got those gongs, mate. I don't want to be associated with them.
A visionary in more ways than one.
Exactly. Okay, Buda Glimt, they're not going to get past the last 16, are they? Or can we not rule them out?
Well, it's funny. They've got either Manchester City or Sporting in the next round, and they've already beaten one of those teams this season, and that was Manchester City. And I think there's a genuine conversation within some City spheres, or fan base, not necessarily within the four walls of the club, saying that it's a crazy sentence to utter. If you'd have told me this 12 months ago, I'd have probably checked myself in to have a checkup from the doctor. But would you rather play Bodo Glimt or would you rather play Real Madrid? And that is a genuine, verifiable debate that is being taken place, because look, when Bodo beat City at the sort of middle of January, City were going through a really tough injury spell, and look, I'm not necessarily taking anything away from the performance, because you've seen against Atleti, against Inter, just what they can do. But I think you do look across the two legs and you'd say that would be a tough ask against either Sporting, who finished 7th in the league phase, or obviously City and all of their riches. But look, sometimes we see it. Even in the modern day, we see these sort of runs. Ajax in 2019, even Villarreal got to the semi-final in 2022.
Where did that Ajax run? When did that end? Who ended that one?
It should have been Man City, because that horrendous Llorente handball in the quarterfinal, which I'm still not over. But yeah, I think if I can rub some salt into the wound, Amos. Last night, and this is as big a surprise in its way, the City Group's team in Brazil, Bahia, got knocked out of the Libertadores in the qualifying round by a little team from Chile, O'Higgins, named after Chile's resistance hero Bernardo O'Higgins. Now, the difference in financial weight between those two teams is incredible. No one saw this coming. It is an absolute unmitigated disaster for Bahia to be without continental competition before the end of February. So there's just a reminder there. You know what? It can happen. It certainly can. It certainly can. And, football has changed a lot over the last 10, 15, 20, 30 years. But that sort of theme that I think, it brings us all back, doesn't it? It drags us all back in when you see a story like this because of the romanticism. So, yeah, they probably will get knocked out in the last 16, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's a given.
Well, Real Madrid, who you seem to fear, but not to the extent that you fear Bodo Glimt. Real Madrid haven't been impressive. They haven't been impressive in this Champions League, I don't think, in any case. But they do seem to have picked up half a pace. If you saw the Wednesday night leg against Benfica, still they do seem to be coming together like they always do, or these great teams always do, as they get closer and closer to the prize ahead. I'm not sure that I would rather meet Bodo Glimt. I'm not sure about that. I think what City have in their favour is the two legs. And I think you've said this before, Tim, the more you play, as an underdog, the more you play against the big teams, the more likely it is that they are going to win, whether the match goes into extra time or whatever it might be. Arguably, Galatasaray's match with Juventus went into extra time, but Juventus were one man down for the second half, the whole of the second half, so they were pretty knackered, to be fair, and they were always fighting rearguard action against the result that they had in the first leg in Turkey. But otherwise, you would have thought, although Galatasaray are a big team now, they're not jokers. You look at their squad and you realise, hang on, they're competing. I think they made a mistake with your former mercurial winger, Leroy Sané, who I couldn't recognise him from the Leroy Sané that played at Manchester City. And it was, people were conflicted over what good he was for Manchester City. Although I thought it was brilliant. He looked brilliant. He was a dribbler and he gave a lot of pace and he could score a goal or two. What on earth has happened to him?
Yeah, he'd just come back from an injury, a short-term injury, for that second leg against Juventus. But I agree, how profligate he was when he was getting into those positions, and in general, he kind of fits that Galatasaray mould because they are the antithesis of Bodo in the sense that they're a team that is sort of amalgamated just names and big names, and it was funny because a somewhat hero of mine in a footballing sense, Ilkay Gundogan, was in the midfield and he was like, no, just give me the ball. If you give me the ball, we will be fine. And it was like you had Sane running into sort of down alleyways, you had Osimhen trying to take players on, and obviously he does get the goal in the end. But the absolute mess that Galatasaray made of that 3-goal advantage heading into the game, obviously Juventus get a penalty, brings them back into the match, a truly farcical VAR situation where you have a player sent off for a second yellow card. I would say probably fair enough. Second yellow card, he goes off the pitch. Then VAR stops the game, gets the referee over to the monitor. You're thinking, are they going to do something that isn't actually allowed and rescind the second yellow card and keep him on the pitch? No, in fact, they just give him a straight red card instead, which was it was really sort of bizarre to see it unfold. But to be fair to Juventus, they rallied, they came back, they took the game to extra time, but like you say, just didn't have the stamina, didn't have the energy, and ultimately were picked off. But yeah, to take it back to that top question, Leroy Sané, I think he will fall into that category of what could have been in terms of, good player. He'll have the Premier League titles, he'll have the trophies of Bayern Munich and the Bundesliga, but you're just looking at him and going, he could have been top 3 or top 4 wingers or something like that, across a sustained period of time. So a little bit sad to see, because I agree when he burst through, he was fantastic.
And he's the highest paid sports person in Turkish history, apparently, according to the commentator last night. Now, Real Madrid won over Benfica, as I was saying, Tim. I remember last week when we spoke, we were talking a lot about Vinicius Junior's stand against racism, I think is the fair way to put it. And we touched on the comparison with South America, not least Brazil and Argentina. You were telling us what was going on there. Any developments on that side from your part, Tim?
No, the row still rumbles on. What the development I would love to see would be Enzo Fernandez stepping up to the plate. I would love to see this, and I think it would be really, really important, because I can see the Argentines, lots of them, just getting further and further into their little shell, saying, what happens on the pitch stays on the pitch. Anything you do to put off your opponent is valid. We don't consider this racist behaviour, and we're going to keep on doing it. We're going to, and in some ways, I think the situation in Argentina is getting worse. And I think it would be fabulous if Enzo Fernandez, who, remember, after Argentina won the Copa America, he filmed himself with some of his teammates there, singing a song which was deeply racist towards France's black players. And that was very, very awkward for him when he went back to Chelsea, because some of those black French players are in that same dressing room. And he had to sit down and listen, And he said, I was wrong. I made a mistake. I regret it. Now I think he's in a fabulous position to pass on that knowledge to his compatriots. I really think it's up to someone like him to stand up and say, I was wrong. Let's stop being wrong together. Because what we're doing is not acceptable in a global context. It's not acceptable. There are 2 instant defense mechanisms from Argentina. One, Sergio Aguero voiced this over the weekend. He said, well, Vini and Rodrigo, they say lots of things on the pitch. They're provoking you. The other is, whenever a team from Argentina goes to Brazil, we're always attacked by the opposing fans or by the police. And there's never any consequences. Now, both of these things can be true. but they've got nothing to do with racism. They don't justify in any way racism. And I think it will be great for someone like Enzo Fernandez just to step up. And one of the good things about Argentine football is that the former players very quickly become coaches. It's great. Like Carlos Tevez at the moment, you never thought he'd become a coach, and he's on his third club, struggling with it, but he's willing to put himself on the line. And that means that the experience that they've gained in top-class European football is permeating through Argentine football. In the same way, I think these players who have the experience of multinational, multicultural dressing rooms and what is necessary in order for there to be harmony, I think it would be fabulous if these kind of players, especially Enzo Fernandez, were to come forward and try and teach their compatriots that this kind of behaviour, it may not be a problem in Argentina. It's certainly a problem as soon as you leave those borders. So that's the development that I would most like to see.
Yeah. What do you think of the likelihood of something like that happening? Enzo Fernandez, obviously Chelsea player.
I don't know, but if he is genuinely repentant,
yeah, no, I get. Absolutely. I totally get what you're saying, Tim. I was just thinking from your point of view, Amos. You're probably closer to what's happening in the Premier League and stuff like that. It would be quite something if he did it, but what's the likelihood?
Yeah, it's been a bitterly depressing week, another bitterly depressing week. And, you just look at the reaction of Benfica's social media page, for example, and you sat there scratching your head and, I don't want to sit here in the ivory tower that is the United Kingdom, because we have issues and we have problems that need to be addressed head first, of course. And I would hope in the dressing room, like Chelsea, for example, you look across the amount of players, the amount of backgrounds, the amount of nationalities, that these are conversations that are being had. I've never been a part of a professional sports dressing room, so I don't necessarily know. But I was struck by a really fantastic, in a roundabout way, fantastic segment that Clarence Seedorf did on the Amazon Prime coverage last week, when he spoke wonderfully. He spoke at length. He spoke about how he's been involved in behind the scenes work to try and find ways and to put an end to the we trying to push back, the words. Basically, he's trying to find action, and there was something that he sort of said in terms of he doesn't necessarily pity the people that believe this is to be the way forward, but he would rather the education be sort of accessible, and I think that's that's something you're alluding to there, Dotun, in the sense, and as well, Tim, that whatever the background, whatever the environment people have come from and believe this to be acceptable is one thing, but at the same time, if you can have those voices that push back against it and say, no, actually, this is why. And I think in a very partisan, in a very fiery world, conversations can go a long way. So, I mean, the colour of my skin, I've never had that lived experience, so I don't want to sit here and necessarily say or speak on that out of turn. But I think the way that Clarence Seedorf spoke about education and how important that is, that really struck me. And I, everyone's got a part to play, and it is depressing. But words, the empty statements, the empty sort of actions won't do anything.
You are right when you say everybody's got a part to play, and everybody's got a right to express themselves as well. I think even sometimes express themselves in ways that aren't necessarily helpful and move the cause forward. But when you say everybody's got a part to play, the way I see it, Tim, is that what you said about that dressing room is really telling, saying all the other players came round and told him why it wasn't acceptable, because they've all got parts to play. We've all got parts to play in this. If one of my colleagues came out with something that was racist, it would hurt. I won't lie, it will hurt. But I would rather have actions than words, because it's very easy to say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that. I was bang out of order." But it's important. I'm not saying it's not important. However, wouldn't it be quite something if, through not even saying words, but showing by your behavior that, hey, that's not who I am. because that's really what we want to see. If you're a Chelsea supporter, you want Enzo Fernandez to reassure you that's not who he is. Okay, for whatever reason it came out like that, and it's inexcusable, etc., etc. So he's got a lot of work to do. I've been in a position where, not somebody has come out and given a sort of a depiction of me, which has nothing to do with me, absolutely nothing to do with me, and I had to sort of like go round. I remember I was working on a newspaper, and I said to the editor, look, this colleague has said something, and I don't know where it comes from. And he said, well, look, the only thing I can advise you to do is go and show every single one of those colleagues that that's not you. And funny enough, when the an accusation came out, the boss said, no, that's not Dotun. No, what happened was the boss went round to the other colleagues and said, this person just made this accusation. And most of my colleagues said, that's not, or all my colleagues said, that's not Dotun. That's not Dotun. You have to go around and show people who you are, and then it filters through, in my opinion. Anyway, let's see what comes of that. A couple of other things to talk about as well. Ahead of the World Cup at the moment, Tim, I suppose it's about managers over there as much as it is about managers over there. You told us a lot about Carlo Ancelotti and how he's getting on with the Brazil team at the moment. Is there anything that the rest of us can learn from him? Thomas Tuchel, for example, can learn from Ancelotti at the moment.
Well, he's the great simplifier, isn't he, Ancelotti? In that sense, I think he's one of those club coaches who is most suited to the international game. He's got very few games. He had, 4 World Cup qualifiers. He had 4 friendlies last year, and he's got 2 friendlies in March. That's 10 games. So you've got to simplify. You've got to have a clear idea of what you want to do. Now, is that the case with Thomas Tuchel? Do you think that Tuchel has a clear idea of what his team is? Or is he still, and this is a question, I don't have the answer.
Yeah, no, I know. It's a good question.
Or in his mind, is he still behaving too much like a club coach who thinks he's got lots of opportunities to tinker here and there and find his perfect blend before the World Cup? Do you think Tuchel is adapting well from club coach to national team coach?
Good question, because similarly we've kind of it's the age old sort of problem that England managers have, because they will go through qualifying absolutely blitzing it and winning and doing fantastic and looking like they're going to be the all conquering team that the English media for so long has sort of requested of the manager, I guess. And then the tournament comes around, and as is the case with international football, you've got, well, it used to be 7 games in this tournament. Of course, it will be 8 games, where the margins are different, the factors at play are different, and it could be a case of, an unlucky bounce of the ball or a dodgy sending off, whatever, and then, your public enemy number one. That's the politician's answer.
I'm sorry, Amos, but do you think something actually happens there when England go off to a World Cup camp, and they, go and set up camp in a hotel in some sort of little known town in the middle of nowhere, and they, build this sort of like bubble around themselves? Something seems to happen to the players that we've seen playing the Premier League.
I often wonder, because they moan about being away from home, don't they? They're just not used to it. It's not something that happens for them to be away from home for that amount of time. And we had Jonathan Wilson on here with his wonderful new history of the World Cup, and he said it was something that came up again and again across different cultures during the course of the tournament. Quite often, we've done enough now. We're homesick. I don't mind losing in the next round. We can go home. I'm homesick, and I wonder if this applies especially to the England team, who are just not used to being away for that length of time anyway. Do you think that might be a psychological factor?
I wouldn't be surprised at all, because obviously, creature comforts and whatnot. I would say Gareth Southgate got a lot of stick, some of it valid, especially towards the end of his tenure. But what he did, more so than any England manager, I would guess in most people's living memories, potentially back to even Alf Ramsey, was that sort of that home family mentality, that do or die mentality, and that he nurtured that first, and that's why I think you look at somebody like Thomas Tuchel, who's obviously an astute tactician, one of the very best coaches, one of the very best football managers. Does he have that in him in terms of making sure that if there is a blip in one of those group matches, if there's a 0-0 or even a 1-0 in the first, a 1-0 defeat in the first couple of matches, how do you respond to that? Because he has, he has been a fiery character in the past. I think the FA are looking at Euro 2028, which is obviously being held in the United Kingdom and Ireland, but England will be in England for all of that, and the last time that was the case in 2021 for the postponed Euro 2020, they obviously got to the final, and for me, they that was the one, that was the opportunity. You look at the issues that Italy have had either side of that tournament, and you go, they definitely didn't deserve, in inverted commas, to win that tournament. So I think the World Cup's a World Cup. It's going to be played in hot climates again. Typically speaking, England or Englishmen not necessarily as effective, let's say, in warmer climates. So I think that'll be something that Tuchel has to manage. But I think Euro 2028
perfectly effective in a warmer climate. Let me tell you that. No decline in performance because of the warmer
exception
climate.
to the rule, perhaps. Tim. I'm certainly not.
Mad dogs, mad dogs.
Yeah.
Mad dogs. I think something happens, and I wonder whether we know, for example, history has taught us that the Wives and Girlfriends Club was just a bad idea. Yeah, it didn't achieve anything. It in fact distracted, I would have thought, many players' minds that their wives and girlfriends are getting on the front pages, and all this sort of nonsense. So we know that didn't work. So they've tried things and thought, maybe let's think again. But there's something else not working. And as much as, it could be homesickness, but to a certain extent, I think you can replicate that. But what you can't replicate is the 2 weeks on the beach that these players' bodies sometimes are asking for after a strenuous season. And I'm not sure whether the Premier League should end a couple of weeks earlier when it's a World Cup year, to give the players just that couple more weeks to come back somewhat refreshed, or whether it's better to just carry on, as it were. They're not going to get any rest whatsoever. They're going to come to those who are fortunate enough to make it right to the end of the Premier League season anyway, with all tournaments and beyond maybe, they're going to go straight from that into a World Cup. I'm not sure. I don't know where you stand on that, whether that's a good thing or not. Because one of the things you've been talking about, Tim, is just how much the effect of carrying on a new season and Champions League, etc., straight off the back of a Club World Cup. It takes a lot out of people. And if your body is expecting, I'm not putting myself on the level of an England footballer, as you can imagine. I've lost that moment, and even I won't kid myself. However, because I work nights, I know that my body has a particular rhythm, and when it needs to sleep, it needs to sleep. Otherwise, I'm not performing well, and it may not need that much sleep, but it does need its sleep.
Yeah, it just looking now, the Champions League final is the 30th of May, and obviously not every England player will be involved in that, but you look at 6 English teams in the last 16, I'm going to hazard a guess and say there is a high percentage chance that one of them gets there. The World Cup begins on June 11th. Now, England have been, I guess you could say, and this maybe illustrates the sort of where we're at with modern day football, a little bit luckier because their first game isn't until the 17th of June because they've been drawn in Group L, which is how far down we're going now because of the expanded World Cup. But it's remarkable, isn't it? It is absolutely remarkable. I totally agree. And I think that's maybe something that we all don't necessarily recognise in the sense that this is just work for them. If we've had a strenuous couple of weeks at work ourselves, themselves, be that in the media industry, be that in manual labour, whatever it is, you feel worn down. Now imagine translating that across 9 months, and then you go into play on the biggest stage of all, where literally the eyes of the world are on you. Mentally as well. I think this is something that goes massively under the radar, the mental fatigue, because physically you could be fine, but there is so much part of that which makes an impact as well. So yeah, I do worry about the quality of this World Cup that's coming up, which is in stark contrast, because obviously the much maligned Qatar 2022 World Cup was bad for plenty of reasons, but the quality of football was incredible, like one of the best I can remember, because of course it was mid-season. So yeah, I do worry that it's going to be a bit of a slugfest in the States and North America this summer.
Yeah, it's a question for you, Tim.
Something's got to give, isn't it? Something has to give at some point. Maybe, just quickly, maybe one suggestion for the Premier League, just to make things a little bit easier. Maybe we could scrap relegation this year. How about that?
No, I wonder why you said that.
Yeah, I wonder why as well. It's not because you're about to win the league. Yeah, we'll get on to Tottenham in just a second. Don't worry. Tim, I'm just like softening you up, I'm fattening you up for the chop. We'll come to that in a moment. But this question for you on Brazil midfield: do you think Marcos Antonio can replace the somewhat aged Casemiro, who's 34 years old, I think, last weekend?
34, yeah. And is the first thing that Ancelotti did when he came in, was to recall Casemiro. First thing. Casemiro is an extension of Ancelotti on the field. And so the only way that Casemiro is going to be replaced is, and this is a real risk, if he picks up a suspension. As happened when they lost to Belgium in 2018. He was suspended for that game. And you're playing in a position where you are apt to pick up suspensions. Brazil do urgently need cover for him. The most likely cover, and I had a look at Fabinho, the former Liverpool midfielder, in the last game. I probably think the most likely cover for Casemiro is André Santos at Chelsea as a holding midfielder. Marcos Antonio, who's playing very well for Sao Paulo, I think both him and the left-footed Danilo, formerly of Nottingham Forest, who's playing very well for Botafogo, I think both of them can come into contention to play alongside the holder. But I don't see Marcos Antonio as the holder. I think he's more of a player of lung power than he is of positional sense. And I don't see... This is a problem, because you'd be thrusting a lot of responsibility on André Santos, who's very young. But that position, I think, is so vital, because what Ancelotti is trying to do is balance out a team with 4 up front. So whoever plays there has to know the game. So I don't think it's a case of replacing Casemiro unless you really have to, in which case I think André Santos is the man being prepared to do that.
Yeah, good question. Should we get on to Dr. Tottenham now? Because Amos, I was expecting, and I think Tim was as well, expecting you to be thanking Dr. Tottenham for 3 points that they would have ensured your Premier League victory. They've made it interesting. Is the title, the Premier League title, still in Manchester City's hands, if it ever was in Manchester City's hands? Because I can tell you, the Gooners that I know are incensed at the reports last week before the Tottenham game was saying, right, the title is now in Manchester City's hands. It's in both our hands, they would scream at me.
Hang on, so, we had an Arsenal fan last week saying exactly that. Yeah, so that belief wasn't just confined to City. No, there were some from Woolwich who were sharing this belief.
Yeah.
Oh man, yeah, it's a roller coaster and a half, isn't it? It's been up, it's been down, it's been over, it's been sort of all sort of directions. I was amongst those who didn't necessarily trust Tottenham Hotspur because I thought They're just a bit bad. They're just a bit rubbish. Although obviously the second half against City a couple of weeks ago maybe says more about City's fragilities at times. Yeah, there's lots of hands over it. There's lots of fingerprints over it at the moment. That title is being pulled in all sorts of directions. What I will say is I think there are 11 games left for City, 10 games left for Arsenal. I think there's going to be at least a couple twists and at least a couple turns, because that's what history has told us this season anyway. When City are getting into a rhythm, they'll have one result and suddenly that's the end of the world. But you've got to maybe look at it in the sense that this is a transition season, and comparatively Arsenal have built themselves up, and understandably so, over a number of years to be in this position where they are kind of the favourites. Well, at least with being spoken about that heading into the season. But the hardest serve to win Wimbledon is obviously the final one, and I think for them that has maybe that sort of feeling has come back to bite them at times in the last couple of weeks. But a massive win away at home to the rivals, I think that'll do them the world of good with the confidence. And Chelsea this weekend, if they get out of that, it's Brighton away in midweek, and then suddenly they're in a much better position. What I will say is the 22nd of March, 4:30 p.m. GMT, Arsenal versus Man City at Wembley. That League Cup final feels a little bit like a proxy title decider, but who knows, because it has twisted and turned a lot.
Of course, I wouldn't like to call that one.
If the hardest serve is the final one, can we still dream about a double fault?
I think potentially. There is. You're just looking at the numbers.
Nobody likes to win Wimbledon in that way, Tim. They always say, "Oh no. I'd rather give the trophy back, because that's not the way to win Wimbledon."
I'm not interested in winning Wimbledon. I'm just interested in stopping them.
But you brought it in, so I thought I'd carry on just to wind you up. Yeah. So are Tottenham going to stay up, or we'll see? Because they are a bit Spursy. We learned the other night that Spursy's become a word in the Swedish political vernacular. And, I wouldn't want to disappoint any of the Swedish MPs in the Riksdagen, as they call them there. Funny enough, like the German. Are Spursy going to be, as we say in Swedish, Spursy?
They have to stay up, don't they? Like a little bit like with the Bodo Glimt conversation. It doesn't bear imagining what could happen if they, not only beat either City or Sporting in the last 16, and then went on and did, anything else remarkable. The gap at the moment, I believe, is 5 points. But just looking at the fixture list in the immediate future, Fulham away, Palace at home, Liverpool away, Forest at home, which is. It's remarkable. Last season, Forest were pushing for Champions League positions in that fixture at a similar time of the season. Now, obviously, that will be a bit of a relegation battle. Sunderland away, and then Brighton at home going into sort of mid-April. I can't even sit here and pretend that they might go down, because they can't. I thought it was a mad enough conversation about West Ham, and they're obviously still very much in that dogfight. But Tottenham, and it's funny because I didn't even realise until about 3 weeks ago, people were speaking about, Spurs going down. I was like, oh yeah, whatever. It'd be like it was last season, where they're actually low in the table, but there's a 10-point gap between them or something like that. No, it is very much within what we would consider the realms of possibility, but surely not. Football's mad, but surely not.
You say that, and funny enough, you echoed the words that were said of West Ham the last time they went down. Everybody say no. West Ham can't go down. No, it's too big to go down. No, West Ham will get out of it. Well, they didn't. And a couple of weeks ago, Tim said, look, he feared for Tottenham. I said exactly the same thing. No, Tottenham. No. West Ham. It's going to be between West Ham and Nottingham Forest, and maybe even Leeds a few weeks back. But now I look, and if I was West Ham or Nottingham Forest, who seem to be, kind of at a pace with each other, I'd be looking at Tottenham and thinking, hang on, let's not focus on trying to win one over Nottingham Forest or over West Ham. Let's focus on trying to drag Tottenham down. And that game, like you said, for Nottingham Forest, it's not just a relegation battle. I think it's crucially going to be very important for West Ham as well. When Nottingham Forest play Tottenham, isn't that mad? If depending on what the positions are at that time, how many points each team has, but if let's say they're on pretty much the same terms as they are now, 5 points ahead to Tottenham. If Nottingham Forest beat Tottenham in that fixture, then surely they're only 2 points ahead, and West Ham and Nottingham Forest only probably need a couple of draws to stay up.
Yeah, I think when it comes to it after 38 games of the season, Spurs will probably be okay just because of the starts of the season that they had. They beat Burnley, they won at City away from home, they beat West Ham away from home, which could actually prove to be such a remarkably important result come the end of the season. And off the top of my head, I think they only lost one of the first sort of 6 or 7, maybe even 8 league matches. So they did have a relatively strong start to the season. It's just since then they've obviously, fallen off the face of the earth.
Are you sending these texts to us, Tim? Because Luciano 4632 is not asking about whether Tottenham are going to get relegated like everybody else I thought would be asking by now. He's asking, are there any Brazilian players having a major role in the clubs that are fighting for the Premier League? Oh, that's a good question, though. It's not a bad one.
Gabriel Magalhães. Yeah, well, Gabriel Magalhães is absolutely vital to the Arsenal cause, isn't he? And he's first choice centre-back for Brazil. The previous, and the coach who took him to the last World Cup didn't trust him. He didn't take Gabriel. He just thought he was too mad. He was always capable of losing his head and doing something stupid. And that is there in him. He's very, very competitive. But he's a beast, isn't he? And he's physical, he's combative, he can play off that left foot. So he's absolutely vital, I think, to Arsenal. And they've also got Martinelli, who is a little bit love him or hate him from the Arsenal fans, and Gabriel Jesus, who again
definitely hates him on that one. I think.
Yes. That was quite sweet actually, because when he came, I gave it. I think it was on Sky, and I was talking about his own problems, Gabriel Jesus' problems being a centre forward. And he kind of really wasn't, after failing for Brazil in the 2018 World Cup, when he was one of Brazil's very, very few centre forwards to not score a goal. It knocked the stuffing out of him, and he kind of ran away from the responsibility of being a goal scorer. So I said this, and I got so much stick from Arsenal fans, real stick. And loads of them afterwards came back and said, "You know what, you were right," and that was quite sweet. That made me like Arsenal just a little bit sometimes. And with City, there is, and I'd really enjoy the opinion of Amos on him, Savinho, because when he came, thought he was going to be the one, and it hasn't quite happened. Where do you think this is going wrong, and do you think that this can be changed?
I'm glad you brought him up, because he has been, especially this season, a divisive player. Last season he had the grace, not only because obviously it was his first season, but relative to City and Guardiola's standards, City had a poor season. And to be fair to him, he had moments, he had real moments of bright sparks, and maybe the goals weren't there, but the assists certainly were. He was one of only I think a couple of players to register over 5 assists for Erling Haaland, which on the surface sounds absolutely mental, because best goal scorer in the world, and he wasn't getting that necessarily that direct service. So he definitely came into this season with a lot of eyes on him. Where I think it's gone wrong has been the saga involving Tottenham Hotspur at the start of the season, because he was kind of, like I said, he had that grace, and it was good first season, or a decent enough first season. Now City going to be better this year. Can you build on that? Can you develop? Can you maybe take your game to this sort of the next level? He's embroiled in the reports at the time was £70 million with Spurs, although there wasn't any viable reports of an actual bid going in, but that was the sort of figure that City were holding out for. And then suddenly the expectation gets ramped up, because you've got to start performing like a £70 million footballer. And unfortunately, in those first few matches when he comes back from that saga, he just doesn't. I find him to be an extremely frustrating player, not too dissimilar to Gabriel Jesus in the sense that some actions will be mind-blowingly good, and that sort of that very typical Brazilian flair, standing a player up, standing a defender up, and getting past them with ease. You stick him in the final third, or not even the final third, just the 18-yard box at times, and it's like he is a child playing football in the sense that the shots are feeble, the decision-making isn't right, and in fairness to him, he is still very young, and that's what I think does go amiss with some City supporters, because I don't think he should have been at a point in his career where he was City's number one starting right winger. There were moments that certainly showed that he could have been that. And it's funny because Semenyo has come in January, obviously from Bournemouth, and he has been getting those goals, getting those assists, getting those goal contributions, but at the same time has looked a little bit clunky in his style of play. Whereas Savinho does all of the lovely fancy stuff, and it's not only fancy, but it's effective as well, except in the final third. So to wrap up that sort of spiel, I would say I think he could have an impact. He could have a real... He has the potential to have a say in this title race from the bench. There was a game at the Bernabeu just before Christmas where he came off the bench and he really stretched the Real Madrid defence at 2-1 and was really sort of effective in getting the ball up the pitch. So I think he could definitely do something like that. But in terms of that sort of main role, I think it's maybe a couple of years off him yet at the moment.
Guys, it's that time when we've got to wrap up proceedings. It's been an absolute pleasure having you with us, Amos. Just remind us again, how can we get hold of the City Ramble podcast?
Yeah, all good podcast platforms and YouTube as well. But that would mean you'd have to look at my face. So I'd recommend the podcast one instead.
I have to look at my face, so I may as well. Mate, don't worry about that. Yeah, thank you very much, Amos Murphy there. And Tim will reconvene very, very soon as well.
Get in touch with the Brazilian Shirt Name Podcast on Twitter at BrazilShirtPod, or you can email us BrazilianShirtNamePod@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, rate and tell a friend. The Brazilian Shirt Name Podcast is an 1129 production.